Welcome to another video lesson of research methodology. The topic of the lesson is secondary data. What is secondary data? It is the data which have been already collected by somebody for their purposes and usable in research. So secondary data is the data which is collected by somebody else for their purpose, but it is usable in research. It is the second hand data that can be usable in research. It is called second hand data because it is collected by somebody else. Then it can be collected from internal, external, published and unpublished sources. It can be collected from internal sources, that means within a particular organization or company, then external sources, that means outside the company, then published and unpublished sources. Example, data collected from a magazine or website is an example of secondary data. As it is not collected as per the requirements of current research, it should be used with proper care and precautions. What are the features of secondary data? First one, it is the second hand data collected by somebody other than researchers. So it is the data which is collected by somebody else for their purpose. It can be collected from internal and external sources. It may be published or unpublished. Secondary data can be collected from published and unpublished sources. Secondary data is relatively cheaper. It needs less effort, time and money. So the collection of secondary data is cheaper. It may not be exactly suitable to the purpose of the research. It is collected by somebody else for their purpose. So it may not be exactly suitable to the purpose of the current research. It may be used without processing. It may be available in processed form. If it is in processed form, there is no need of further processing. Relevance, accuracy and timings are the main problems of secondary data. It is very difficult to measure the relevance and accuracy of secondary data. Timing is the another problem. It may be collected in a previous period and therefore it may be outdated data. Researchers have a little control over secondary data. It is collected by somebody else. Therefore, the researcher has a little control over or a small control over secondary data. Sources of secondary data. There are two major sources of secondary data. Published sources. It is the most used source. Then unpublished sources. Published sources. Published sources include government and semi-government publications. Then census reports and statistical abstracts. Publications of international bodies like UNO. Reports of trade associations such as Chamber of Commerce. Reports of committees and commissions appointed by government for various purposes. Then private publications, newspapers, magazines and other periodicals. Published research reports of universities and research institutions. Web resources or the resources on internet, etc. Published data consists of first one, proprietary data. Proprietary data is the copyrighted data owned and controlled by individual and organizations. Then second one is the open data or open educational resources. It is the data freely available to use and republish without any restrictions. Open data can be freely accessible and we can republish this data without any restrictions. Then unpublished sources of secondary data. Unpublished sources include records and unpublished reports of research agencies, then records and files maintained by private firms, then statistics collected and maintained by government departments which is not published, then health records, then research works of scholars, then sources of secondary data for business research. As far as the business research is concerned, there are different sources of secondary data. First one, internal sources. Internal sources are sources inside the firm. It includes invoices, annual reports, financial statements, brochure, accounts, customer letters, sales reports, etc. And the second one is the external sources. That means outside the firm. It consists of published and unpublished sources. Published sources consist of books, journals, reports, web resources, publications of government and research agencies. Then unpublished sources consist of unpublished data of research agencies, scholars, etc. What are the advantages of secondary data? First one, it helps the researcher to familiarize with the problem and industry. It is very useful in the initial stage of research. It helps the researcher to familiarize with the problem and industry. It is accessible with less time and effort. It is relatively inexpensive. Some information is only available from secondary sources. Some data cannot be collected from primary sources. It is available only in the form of secondary data. It supports primary data, then useful for longitudinal studies. Then limitations of secondary data. It may not be exactly suitable with the requirements of the current research. Secondary data may be general and vague. It may be collected through an improper procedure. It may be collected by the previous researcher through an improper procedure. Sometimes secondary data is influenced by the prejudice of the previous investigator. Then the data may be old and out of date. That means the data may be collected in a previous period and therefore it may be out of date. It is not possible to assess the accuracy, reliability, validity, consistency and credibility of secondary data. The researcher has a little control over secondary data. Then precautions to be taken while using secondary data. First one, ensure that the data is suitable to the purpose of the research. Before using secondary data, the researcher has to ensure that the data is suitable to the purpose of the research. Ensure that the data is adequate for the requirements of the current research. Check the degree of accuracy of data. Ensure that the time and period of data collection is relevant to the current research. Ensure that the data is consistent and comparable. Then do test checking of data. Then use proper citations in the case of proprietary data. If the proprietary data is used, we have to use proper citations. Then what are the differences between primary data and secondary data? Primary data is the data collected by researcher himself for his purpose, but the secondary data is collected by other persons for their purposes. Then primary data is the first hand data and the secondary data is the second hand data. Primary data is original and relevant to the researcher's needs and does not need any adjustment. But the secondary data is not original and need changes to suit with the researcher's objective. Then primary data is rudimentary form. That means it is the raw data. But the secondary data is in refined form or it is the processed data. Then primary data is the real-time data and secondary data is the past data. Then primary data is collected through observation, survey, experimentation, etc. But the secondary data is collected from internal, external, published and unpublished sources. Primary data is more reliable. Secondary data is less reliable. Primary data is costly and time consuming. Then secondary data is economical and time saving. Then primary data needs more effort, but the secondary data entails less effort. Then in primary data, researchers have high degree of control over data, but the researcher have a little control over secondary data. Then primary data is not available to the public, but the secondary data is generally published and available to all. Thank you.